let's take the position that for right now, the position of humanitarian intervention, no, it should never be okay. Not only should it be illegal, it just shouldn't be done. Now, I know you want to make this moral argument, but people are dying, da 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 da. Here's the argument against that. And then we'll talk about the yes here in a second. So first of all, the easiest thing is states don't claim it's something that they do very often. Like even in the two cases, the two examples that I threw out at you here, the one in Burma and the one in Yugoslavia or in Serbia, the first one with the Burma one, they didn't actually end up doing it. And in the second one, they did humanitarian intervention, but they didn't claim that that's what they were doing. They said they were doing something else. So there's really no state practice, no opinio juris. You might have to go back to your international law lecture and look that one up. States don't believe that it's legal to do. The other thing is states don't act altruistically. Altruistically means you act without any regard for yourself, but only for others. So, will a state actually go in just to provide human rights protections and then leave? And the problem here that the opponents, the no camp says, is that there's going to be an abuse of humanitarian intervention. Is that the United States will say, man, we sure need some oil. Look at all the human rights violations happening in Saudi Arabia. So we send in troops to protect people against humanitarian intervention, and oh, look, oil. And now we get the oil too. So the fear is that humanitarian intervention will become a thing that becomes abused to get other things that the state wants. Another argument is the UN Charter does not permit it. So the United Nations is set up, and its constitution is this thing called the UN Charter. It's sort of the basic rules of the game. Just like the Constitution is the basic rules of American society, the UN Charter is sort of the basic rules of the international society. And there's this thing called Article 2.4. Article 2.4 essentially says that states give up the right to use force or threaten to use force in other states. There are two exceptions, but there's only two exceptions to that rule. Those exceptions, do you remember I said them at the beginning? One exception is self-defense. If someone's attacking you, you can defend yourself. The other exception, UN Security Council authorization. If the UN Security Council says you can use force, you can use force. That's it. There are no other reasons that it is legal to use force. And states have an incentive to protect that so that other states don't have good reasons to use force against them. So the argument goes, if we open up another exception, more exceptions will follow. If we say, well, here's a third exception, well, then maybe there's a fourth exception and a fifth exception, and all of a sudden there's tons of exceptions to the rule. Exceptions tend to weaken the principle of sovereignty. The more exceptions we make, the more we say sovereignty doesn't hold here, sovereignty is not important here. And if we go back to our very early part of this class, sovereignty is a key element of the Westphalian state system. The whole system kind of breaks down without sovereignty. So we start to weaken sovereignty, we start to weaken the whole system. And sovereignty is really the thing that's more often than not protecting human rights. Who's the most likely thing that's going to protect your human rights? Is your state. And so if we weaken sovereignty, do we weaken the ability of states to protect human rights? Even though, so in this one situation here, we may protect this group of people's human rights, but weaken the system so much that next year more people's human rights are in jeopardy. That's the argument. But then you might say, well, come on, look at the two cases that we just looked at. In the first one, China blocked the Security Council from doing something. In the second one, Russia blocked the Security Council from doing something. So the UN system is flawed. So let's just throw this whole thing out. The argument would go then, the UN Security Council is flawed, but it can still act if the situation is bad enough, like it did in Libya 2011. So yeah, it doesn't work perfectly, but it does work somewhat. And maybe the task should be to make the UN Security Council work better rather than just throw the system out and come up with your own sort of rules. Okay, so those are reasons against humanitarian intervention. Another would be forceful intervention doesn't always work. This is going to be, and I don't mean it's only about the pacifist. The pacifist is going to argue, how can you solve violence with violence? That's completely ridiculous. But we can also make the argument, just because you do a humanitarian intervention doesn't mean you solve the problem. I'll give you an example, Rwanda. If the United States would have sent in troops into Rwanda in 1994, would they have stopped the genocide? The answer is almost certainly. The genocide would not have happened if U.S. troops were roaming around. How long would the United States have to stay there? Would they have fixed the underlying problem that would have prevented the genocide? Once the U.S. troops left, would a genocide have happened then just next year? So this is the thing. Forceful intervention can make a bad situation worse. It can prolong a bad situation. A good example might be the Syrian Civil War. The Syrian Civil War probably would have been over a long time ago had not the U.S., Russia, and a bunch of other countries got involved in that. And then it may just postpone inevitable problems. Like you might not have a genocide this year, but you might have it next year or the year after that. So this is what we call here, this position of humanitarian intervention, no. We call this the restrictionist position. In other words, we're going to restrict how we interpret Article 2.4. Article 2.4 is that states cannot use force against other states. So we're going to restrict the number of exceptions. There's only 2 exceptions in the UN Charter. Don't add another one for humanitarian intervention, even though you think that it's super moral. It creates more problems than you solve. You intervene in this little case, and hooray, you've done something really nice, and you feel good about yourself, but you've actually made things worse all around. That's the argument. All right, take a look at this video, and I'll come back and we'll talk about humanitarian intervention. Yes.